now the main attraction of our meeting is our guest speaker, Art Evans. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you for having me. Shall I go ahead and take it away?
Sure.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Let's see what we got here.
Honey? Oh, honey.
If I could get everybody to mute their microphones, that would be great, because I'm easily distracted.
Love you.
Okay. First of all, I want to say again, thank you very much for allowing me to address you this evening. I have always wanted to attend a Pacific Coast Entomological Society meeting in person. And for one reason or another, I've never been able to do it. Zoom is as close as I get. It's a poor second, but it's better than nothing. And I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you this evening. Just a little bit about myself. I'm a trustee and a research associate at the Virginia Museum of Natural History. I'm a research associate at the California State Collection of Arthropods. I'm also associated with Smithsonian, and I'm an adjunct assistant professor at 3 universities here in the Richmond, Virginia area: Randolph-Macon College, University of Richmond, and Virginia Commonwealth University. And I teach entomology, medical and veterinary entomology, and insects and humans, which is a course for non-science majors. Boy, we're sure getting an echo here. I'm starting to hear myself, and I don't know why that is. I'll try and talk through it. I do a lot of different things here.
Art, you're muted.
Art, you are muted. We can't hear you.
I'm surprised you let me get this far in before somebody said something. I'll just keep going here. I don't think you missed anything of importance. My apologies. I wear a number of different hats here in Richmond, Virginia. I'm an educator. I teach at several colleges and universities. I teach 3 courses in entomology, entomology proper, medical and veterinary entomology, as well as insects and humans, which is a non-science majors course. I've also had a radio segment on that aired in Richmond Public Radio during NPR's Morning Edition. And I've written several books on beetles and other insects and arthropods. And when I have a little bit of time, I try to do a little bit of research too. But tonight, what I'd like to share with you is my latest book, and published by Princeton University Press, and that's Beetles of Western North America. And this work covers 1,428 species in all 131 families known to occur west of the Continental Divide. It includes over 1,500 images. There's an illustrated key to the most commonly encountered beetle families. There are family diagnoses, species accounts, and current information on all the species included in terms of their distribution, biology, and so on. This work would have been impossible were it not for the generosity of numerous photographers. I was lucky enough to be able to provide half of the 1,500 images in the book, but I had another approximately 120 photographers, some of whom are in the audience tonight, and thank you again. Your copies should be on their way. They might be delivered as I speak, but I want to again thank all of these people. The quality of this book and the diversity of this book taxonomically wouldn't be possible without the efforts of these fine people. I also want to take a moment to thank Jen Reed. She's a very good friend of mine in Ontario, Canada. And Jen worked with me on the first book, The Beetles of Eastern North America, and helped me put together a lot of the morphological plates, the photographs that are labeled with morphological features. She did the close-up photography for claws and other parts. And she also did the original illustrations for the book that appeared in the section on morphology, as well as illustrating major morphological features for the family key. And she made sure that every one of the photographs that went into this book looked their absolute best. The book, as I said, covers the area west of the continental divide. And even though that covers everything from Australia down to Western Mexico, the focus is primarily on species that occur in southern British Columbia, down to Southern California and southeastern Arizona. There's an extensive introduction in the book that covers beetle morphology. Although I don't spend a lot of time talking about larvae, I do include images of larvae so you can get the idea of the diversity of their forms as well. And I was just lucky that the spacing in the plates worked out in such a way that there's a nice spread of larvae that you just open up the book and you'll see quite a selection of the immature stages of these fascinating animals. There's also information on the behavior and natural history of beetles. And I tried to highlight some different things that are pertinent to the West in particular. And there's just a paragraph or two mentioning the work of my friend, Anna Holden. Some of you might be familiar with her work. She was part of a team that discovered a cache of 40,000-year-old insect remains inside a camel skull in the La Brea tar pits. And with this cache of arthropod fragments, she and her group were able to make some interesting developed some interesting hypotheses as to the paleoclimate, the climate of the Los Angeles basin 40,000 years ago. Based on plant materials and other findings in the La Brea tar pits, it was always thought by many that the habitat was relatively cool during this time. But the the insects that were found in these areas clearly indicate that the climate was very likely warmer and drier. One of the interesting things that was found in this camel skull was this remains right here, and this is of a modern beetle. This is, of course, under pressure here, I'm going to flub up the name. I can't remember what it is now. Anyway, it's a clarid, one of the ham beetles, Necrobia violacea. And for years, it was thought that this was a European species that was inadvertently introduced with the Spanish into Western North America, or with the Europeans in Eastern North America. But the fact that there were remains found in this deposit that are 40,000 years old clearly establishes that this beetle was here already. And whether it is naturally distributed here, or it was inadvertently introduced from North America to the old world, we really won't know. At least we won't know yet. But I thought that was an interesting story to shed or share about one of the things that's going on in Western North America. I roped a number of my friends into posing or allowing me to photograph them, involved in different collecting techniques. Some of you will recognize, boy, my computer's doing weird things here too. Sorry. Here with his pool nets, skimming leaf material and other flotsam and jetsam floating on the canals along the western slopes of the Sierra Nevada. Other people have engaged in this activity as well, and by sorting through the material that washes along these canals, there are some amazing insects, particularly beetles, that are found by this method. In fact, these canals are sort of like big traps that collect all sorts of insects. And Dave took me up to the spot, and we spent an afternoon. I had never done this before. I'd certainly read about it. I knew other people that had done this, but this was my first opportunity taking part in this sort of activity, and it was incredibly productive. Next to him is Matt Gimmel of the Santa Barbara Museum, and he's demonstrating one of the many uses of a light-colored pan. You can use it as a beading tray, putting it underneath vegetation, giving the vegetation a sharp whack, and things will fall off on the plants. Or you can take handfuls of leaf litter, rotting wood, moss, put it in the pan and very carefully sort through it and find beetles that you can pick up with featherweight forceps or with an aspirator. It's really a handy method to use. Next to him is my good friend Bob Anderson from the Canadian Museum of Nature. This photograph was taken at the Southwest Research Station a few years ago, where Bob was part of a weevil workshop, and he was demonstrating how to sift leaf litter. And Bob has sort of turned me into a convert and was kind enough to give me all the materials necessary to start sorting leaf litter here. And on his visits here to Richmond, we've turned my basement into a drying room where leaf litter is hanging in and the beetles are being extracted. And finally, on the right is Chris Worth, and he's looking at a blacklight setup that I had going in the Huachuca Mountains a few years back. Ron McPeak is looking for beetles on Pine Slash. This is up in Oregon. I felt like a kid again when I was on my Oregon trip, because we would visit these slash piles and they were just crawling with beetles. I mean, the diversity was incredible. I just happened to be there at the right time. A lot of the photographs that are in the book are based on collections at this site and those like it. And finally, Pacific Coast Entomological Society's very own Ted McRae is showing how to use a beading sheet, and his handle, net handle, is a beading stick. Ted and I joined forces in Arizona for a week in 2018. And although I've known Ted for years, I haven't had very few opportunities to spend any time in the field with him, and we had a great time. He's a fantastic traveling companion. Here's some other trapping techniques that are very useful for attracting and collecting beetles. One of the sort of become very popular just in the last couple of years. This is called a V-fit trap, or a V-shaped flight intercept trap. This is a trap that Bill Warner put together based on a horsefly trap, as I recall. And it's simply a frame, a metal frame with conduit, and then a single sheet of plastic that is draped in between the two uprights. And then there's a metal bar as a weight that's put in the middle. That's what gives it the V shape. And then there are pans of fluid, propylene glycol, or some other fluid if you're checking it on a daily basis. And all kinds of insects will come along, but especially beetles. Those of you that do malaise trapping know that beetles will wind up in the collection bottle, but many of them will hit the interior wall and just fall to the ground to be lost forever. And some people get around this by putting these trays or something like them at the bottom. In this particular trap, beetles will come along, and if you've ever watched a beetle, when it hits a barrier, they tend to bounce along downwards or upwards or to the side and around. But the angle of this particular sheet, the few beetles I've seen actually go into the trap, they seem to bounce along, but they're directed downward until they go in the fluid, and then they can be sifted out later. This is a 2-liter plastic soda bottle trap, and you simply cut the top off at the shoulder, then cut the neck off, and that little piece becomes a funnel. You invert it, punch a couple of holes on the side, take some wire, loop it around. Of course, you do that after you've put in some of your favorite fermenting fruit or concoction, hang it up in trees, and then wait and see what comes in. This can be very productive in the east. It is hit and miss in the west simply because it's so dry. But if you have enough bait and you're in a fairly wet part of the season and you check it regularly, it can be productive. I will say the first time that I tried this was when I was a grad student in Pretoria, South Africa, and it works like gangbusters. So if you ever get a chance to use this trap in other areas too, it's fantastic. This is something I just played around with, and I did include it in the book because I thought it was interesting. This is a corn cob feeder. You can buy them for a couple of bucks at Lowe's or some other hardware store. It's heavy duty coiled metal that's coated in plastic, and it's for putting dried corn cobs in to feed birds. But I got the idea, why not stuff it with cut up oranges or rotting bananas or plantains? And on one of my Arizona trips, I started scattering them around, and I found them to be very productive. If you're looking for cotinus, this is your trap. If you're looking for a little more diversity, you're gonna have to look a little harder, although you will notice there's a euphoria tucked away in here, but there were other beetles that came in. This gem, also suggested by Bill Warner's, a very simple dung beetle trap, and it's just poop on a stick. I'll just call it what it is. You just take your favorite feces. I won't go into too much detail here, but human dung is best. And just get a blop on the end of a stick and put it over a bowl and use that as a pitfall. Bury it so it's flush and put in some soapy water or propylene glycol mixture with water, and check it every day or every few days, and voila, you have dung beetles. And these traps work very well, certainly in southern Arizona, and mixed results in drier areas in California and along the Pacific coast, but you will get whatever beetles are out there. I mentioned that there's a key. It's a fool's errand to think I could come up with a key that would properly place every beetle in Western North America into the proper family. So what I've attempted to do here is put together a key that most beetles would work in, and you would more likely than not be directed to the proper family, or in this case, a group of families. And so the bold-face families are your first choices of where you might want to check those sections of the book to see if your beetle matches any of the photos in there. And then the families that are not in boldface, you might want to use those, refer to those families in case you don't find them your first choice. But I found that for the Eastern book, which also had a key very similar to this, for my students, the key works very well, because with rare exception, the beetles that they're finding are the ones that will come out in these keys where you want them to turn out. Of course, the heart of the book are the families. As I said, the book covers 1,428 species, but at every opportunity, unlike the Eastern book, I tried to add additional information so you could tease out additional species in the genus. If there was only 2 or 3 species in a genus found west of the continental divide, I did whatever I can in the limited space that I had to give you specific characters as to how to separate those few species within that genus. So for every family, there's a pronunciation guide for the family itself. I know I'm going to take some flack about these guides from some people, but this is the way that I've pronounced these families, and most of the people I know, I realize that North American Latin pronunciations are not European Latin pronunciations. It's futile to argue with an Italian, for example, on the correct pronunciation of Latin. But as I've tried to feebly explain, if I pronounce things correctly in North America, nobody would know what I was talking about. So there is an explanation as to the sources I chose to use to come up with this description. But anyway, each family has a little bit of information on its biology. There's a family diagnosis to help you separate or distinguish the particular family. There's also a section on similar families. Sometimes the families are so distinctive that it's just a few lines. In other cases, there are bullet points that will give you specific details on how to distinguish different families, and then it's cross-referenced with those families, so you can easily go back and forth in the book. And of course, then we've got the fauna, and this refers to North America, which is the United States and Canada in this book. And this just simply indicates that there are 4 species in one genus found in the United States and Canada. And then there's a diagnosis for each species, and in parentheses, the number indicates the number of species within that genus found west of the continental divide. Now, if you have a high number here, you should identify something based on a photo alone with great caution. Most beetles, you need to have them in hand, as many of you know. And so looking at photos only is not always the best way to identify beetles authoritatively, but certainly for some of the better known species, or species that are very distinctive among the fauna, you can do well. And one of the things that you'll notice too is that I've included the authority names. So many popular field guides don't include the authority's name, and I've done this for all species because that is part of the scientific name of these animals. And when you start looking at the different authorities that are mentioned over and over again, you'll see the name Leconte and Horn and Casey. And so I wanted to take a moment just to talk about these. If there was a Mount Rushmore type monument dedicated to the top coleopterist in the West, this might be what it would look like. And I just want to take a few moments to mention these individuals. John Lawrence Leconte tops the list. He was one of the most eminent entomologists of the 19th century. He describes some 5,000 new species of beetles, many of which occur in Western North America. He was a pioneer in the classification of North American beetles, and he's considered to be the father of American beetle study. And of course, right next to him is George Henry Horn. Horn arrived in California during the Civil War. He collected beetles throughout the state, as well as in parts of Arizona and Nevada. Horn described 154 new genera and more than 1,600 species.
Wow.
And upon Leconte's death in 1888, he became the preeminent coleopterist in North America. Keep Horn's name in mind because he will have influenced one of the other great coleopterists here in North America. Thomas Lincoln Casey collected beetles in California from San Diego to Eureka from 1885 to 1886, and he secured a wealth of material. He described nearly 10,000 new species in 40 years, publishing almost 9,000 pages on their taxonomy and biology. Much of Casey's work has been criticized as many of his species were synonyms of previously described taxa. And he had a very different species concept. In fact, some would argue he had no species concept. The slightest differences in very common beetles, he would go ahead and describe it as a new species. However, some of his work in smaller, more obscure groups of beetles seems to have held up because for his time, he had an excellent microscope. He had a very keen eye for very subtle differences. But for some of the larger, more common things, he described as many as 15 or 20 synonyms for these species. Henry Clinton Fall made significant contributions to the study of beetles in North America, especially in the West. And it's interesting to note that his first paper, which was published in 1893, was inspired by a visit from George Horn. George Horn made his last trip to the West just a few years before he died, and got together with Fall and encouraged him to publish his findings. In fact, his very first paper was on beetles found in the southern Sierra Nevada of California. Of course, we know the southern Sierra Nevada today as the San Bernardino Mountains. And Fall writes very interesting notes about the habitat and the saw camps and things like that. I've always been interested in Fall, and I've been piddling around with a biography of Fall for many years, and I think he's one of the most interesting figures in coleopterology in the United States. His collection contained nearly 200,000 specimens representing 20,000 species, and it now resides with those of Leconte and Horn at the Museum of Comparative Zoology at Harvard University. I should also mention too that he was one of the founders of the Pacific Coast Entomological Society. And as I recall, he was its first president. Don't quote me on that, but I believe he was one of the, or at least one of the early presidents. And then finally, Edwin Van Dyke, excuse me. He was an outstanding authority on beetles of the Pacific states. He was also an expert on forest pests and the distribution of insects, especially beetles in Western North America. Some of his earlier papers in the 1920s, 1930s, talking about distribution of insects in North America, particularly beetles, are really interesting reading. Van Dyke was an inspirational teacher as well as an enthusiastic and conscientious collector. I add that because he always mentions, or at least in some of his articles, that whenever he would move bark or rocks or whatever looking for beetles, he'd always take pains to replace them. If he found a good spot, he would always want to be able to go back. His collection of 200,000 beetles was presented to the California Academy of Sciences in 1924. And this is not insignificant because the collections of the California Academy of Sciences were virtually totally destroyed by the fire after the San Francisco earthquake in 1906. And Van Dyke's donation of his beetle collection was a huge jumpstart to get the Cal Academy back on track. The book, Beetles of Western North America, is dedicated to my parents, Ed and Lois Evans, and also a number of people that made significant contributions to my ability to study insects. You'll note in the beginning of the book, I talk about that the Beetles of Eastern North America was my way of learning about the beetle fauna of the East Coast by getting familiar with those beetles in Virginia. And the Beetles of Western North America for me was like a homecoming. So if you'll forgive me for the next several minutes, I want to go into some of the tremendous influences on me that led me to write this book. So as I wrote this book, I've been thinking a lot about my history. I think this is the curse of getting into your 40s, 50s, and 60s. You start thinking back. That's me at the tender age of 13 years old with my first insect net made with a broom handle, a coat hanger, and notice those pesky corners in my net bag that was sewn together with cheesecloth by my mother, but that was my trusty companion on many trips. This is a photograph my dad took of me not far from June Lake in the Sierra Nevada. We would go on camping trips every year during the summer. We spent 1 week at the Central Coast at the beach because my mother loved the beach. And we'd always go somewhere in the Sierra Nevada for a week because my dad loved the mountains. And of course, for me, it was all good because the insects were great in these places. I was very much involved in 4-H, and I wasn't one of those kids that had chickens and goats and horses and guide dogs. I had bugs. And none of the adults felt comfortable with what they knew about insects, so they pretty much let me run the show. And I remember when I was in the 6th or 7th grade, we had a demonstration day and everybody was outside with their animals. And of course, everybody's outside with the animals. And I'm sitting all by myself with a card table with my 5 cigar boxes of my insect collection and my field guides, my golden guide to insects. And I was ready there to answer any questions that anyone had. And this gentleman came walking in and introduced himself as Chris Henney. And Chris was the very first entomologist that I ever met. He was a preparator at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles back in the 40s. And he was a very keen observer and collector of moths. And he collected moths and reared them in captivity. That way his specimens would be postage stamp perfect. And he provided materials that were illustrated by others. He kept meticulous notes on the natural history and life cycles of these insects. And to just sort of fall into his life and to be invited into his home and see his collection was just incredible. He had a rearing room. Everything was meticulous. He was just a very exacting, very generous individual. I was already leaning toward beetles at this time, but to see someone so dedicated to one group of insects and so knowledgeable about them was really an inspiration to me. And of course, in 4-H, I would enter my collection in the Antelope Valley Fair, and you can see that I was a grand champion a couple of years, even took home a couple of trophies. When I entered high school, Palmdale High School, I had 2 biology teachers that were incredibly supportive of me. And Bob Brister and Mike Hanlon. I still can't say Bob and Mike very easily. They told me to call them that years ago, but they'll always be Mr. Brister and Mr. Hanlon to me. I'm still in contact with Bob Brister. But in the between my sophomore and junior years, I think that's about 1973, I had a summer school class that they team taught called field biology. And this was the best course I've ever taken in anywhere in my entire career. And we went out on 2 overnight field trips every week and 1 day trip. We visited museums, we made collections, we prepared study skins of vertebrates, we made insect collections, we made shell collections, we did vegetation mapping. It was incredible. And this was all in a high school class. Again, I was very lucky to be a part of this. And it's a real treat to be in touch with still one of my very influential teachers today. On my first trip to the Natural History Museum, Chris Henney set up my first visit, and I got a chance to meet the curators and get a behind the scenes tour of the Natural History Museum. On that very first trip, I met Bob Duff, and Bob Duff invited me to go on a 3-week field trip with him to southeastern Arizona to collect beetles. And this was amazing to me. For years, I had always collected my family trips, but I'd never gone on a trip before that was dedicated to collecting insects. And over the next 6 years, Bob and I went on a number of field trips all over Southern California, all over Arizona, Southern New Mexico, and even as far as Western Texas, collecting insects. And even though at that time I was very interested in collecting all arthropods, because of Bob's influence and his generosity and his knowledge, I quickly became interested or started to focus on beetles because I had more of them than anything else. And it's specifically because of Bob's influence that I became interested in scarabs and still am today. Now, I mentioned that first trip to the Natural History Museum. I got to go behind the scenes, and that's where I met the curators of the day. Roy Snelling, a hymenopterist who was a well-known ant-man, Julian Donahue, lepidopterist who focused on tiger moths, and Charlie Hogue. Charlie was a world authority on Diptera, but specialized in the family Blepharisaurids. And Charlie was a great mentor to me, although it took a little bit for those seeds to really germinate. Charlie was a world-class scientist, but he was also very interested in public education. He was interested in insect photography and popular writing. And all those things kind of were mixed around in my brain. He was very supportive of my interests in entomology, took me on several great field trips. And even though I wasn't doing insect photography then, he took photographs of some of the beetles I collected. And several of those photographs, thanks to his son, Jim, are included in the book. And I'm really glad to include his work. Through Bob Duff's influence, he kept talking about Elbert Sleeper. Yeah, you've got to meet Elbert Sleeper. You ought to consider getting your degree at Cal State Long Beach. And that's what I did. I signed up at Cal State Long Beach to study under Elbert Sleeper. Sleeper was a world authority on weevils. And it was during my time at Cal State Long Beach that I met Chuck Bellamy, who you see here on the right. And Chuck became one of my best friends, my college roommate, and my first co-author on a book that some of you may have heard of, An Inordinate Fondness for Beetles. It was because of Chuck's influence that I wound up in South Africa to work on my doctorate in entomology. Here we are on our first night. This was my first trip to the tropics. Almost everybody I know, their first tropical trip was Southern Mexico, Costa Rica, Panama. Not me, I was in Malawi. And we're all looking very long-faced because we had camped out in the bush on our first night in Malawi, and there was something out there with us that kept moving around and rustling around. We could never figure out what it was. None of us slept very well. It was hot, it was sticky. And so there's a lot of unhappy campers here in this picture, but there we are. But here's Chuck and myself and my major professor, Clark Skoltz, who many of you have probably heard of with his dung beetle work. Here I am with Marcus Byrne, fellow grad student at WITS, the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Some of you might know Marcus today because of his book, Dance with the Dung Beetle. You may have seen his TED Talk, Dance of the Dung Beetle. And if you haven't seen it, please do. It's Monty Python meets really cool behavioral studies in dung beetles in Southern Africa. And I use this photo in my classes, and I told Marcus that I was using it. He wanted me to reassure everyone that he has a job now and he can afford clothes. He doesn't dress like this anymore. But while I was in South Africa, I worked on scarabs, and I focused primarily on melilonthine scarabs. This is Sparmania, a genus that I monographed while I was in country there. When I came back, after I graduated, finished my dissertation, I came back to the United States, and immediately I got a job as a technician in the entomology department at the Natural History Museum. I knew everybody, everybody knew me. I fell into a job there until I could was going to do. The Natural History Museum had just received a $2 million grant to start an insect zoo. Now, insect zoos may not seem like a big deal today because they're everywhere. But back then, there were only 3 insect zoos, one at the Smithsonian, the Cincinnati Zoo, and the San Francisco Zoo. I had an opportunity here to start the 4th insect zoo in the United States. And I lobbied everybody that would listen to me that I was the guy, because I've always had a longstanding interest in informal science education. And that's where I worked for 10 years as the director of the insect zoo. And I created a cradle to grave bug program, as I called it. We had a traveling insect zoo that went out to kindergartens, elementary, high schools. I went to libraries, shopping centers, summer camps. We did workshops for teachers and how to bring insects into the classroom. I worked with the Lorquin Society in helping to build the Lorquin Insect Fair, which eventually came to the Natural History Museum and morphed into the Bug Show, which is still, before pandemic times, was the largest public event that they sponsor, a 2-day event. While I was at the insect zoo, I was approached by a publisher whose friend founded the company Maxilla and Mandible. They're no longer in existence, but they were known then for selling dinosaur fossils. That's where you could go and buy a T-Rex skull if you wanted to, but they also sold insects and other specimens, and they had provided insects for ancillary exhibits for backyard monsters, a giant robotic bug exhibit that was traveling around at that time. And I was the consultant on the original set of Backyard Monsters. And I was working with label writers from the Monterey Bay Aquarium, the Science Museum in Seattle, to develop this exhibit from scratch. And the publisher and Henry Galliano of Maxilla and Mandible always wanted to write a picture book, a coffee table book about beetles in Henry's collection. So that's how I made the connection. They contacted me and said, would you be interested in writing this book? And I jumped on it. I said, absolutely. And then I went into a panic. I thought, this is the kind of book that a middle career or late career entomologist writes, not somebody who's just starting out. And in my panic, I thought, misery loves company. Who could I drag into this project but my best friend, Chuck Bellamy? And so that's how we became involved. This was it. And the moment we signed on to do it together, I'm in the States and now he's in South Africa. And there was this newfangled technology that was becoming more popular, electronic mail. And we were able to exchange manuscripts electronically that way. And that kept the book moving along. And it appeared in the mid-90s. There's also a Japanese edition out there too. Also, during my time at the insect zoo, I was invited to write a section on the melanothines for the American beetles, the 2nd volume. This work is now being rebooted, and it will be called Beetles of Canada and the United States. Hopefully we'll see that in another 4 or 5 years. And by that time, the Inordinate Faunas for Beetles came out in paperback, and it was published by the University of California Press. Just so happens I was involved in another University of California Press, Arizona Sonoran Desert project called A Natural History of the Sonoran Desert. And I wrote the chapter for the Beatles. They had a book launch at the Arizona Sonoran Desert Museum, and I attended. And it just so happened the editor of University of California Press introduced herself to me and said, so do you have a book, an idea for another book? Fortunately, I did. I just blurted out, I want to do a handbook of the Beetles of California. And that's what became these 2 books, an introduction to California beetles and a field guide to beetles of California. I felt awful about the fact that I was moving away from California just at this time. And I thought, I really need somebody who knows their stuff, who can help me pull this off. And sure enough, Charlie's son, Jim, stepped up. Jim and I have been very good friends for years. He's a superb photographer, an excellent writer, does great illustrations. He's in the audience here. I don't see him turning red yet, but I think very highly of Jim. So we published these 2 books. Unfortunately, they're out of print, but you can still find them used. And I scored a couple of copies at Pinnacles National Park in their bookstore, hard copies. And so I bought several. So I'm now in Virginia since 2000. And as I said, I work primarily as an adjunct professor. I'm a radio broadcaster, but I also try to keep my hand in doing research. And for the last 15 years, I've been collaborating with Andrew Smith at the Canadian Museum of Nature. And we've been working to shore up the taxonomy of the New World melolontine scarabs. And our most recent paper just came out last year on the tribal classification of the Nearctic melolontany, where, among other things, we formally provide a diagnosis for the only known specimen of a female acoma. For those of you that are familiar with these little flighty, long-legged beetles, they're only known from males that fly to lights. Only one female has ever been found, and as suspected, they are flightless. Also, during my time here, I was approached to do a book on the beetles of Eastern North America, which is the companion volume to Beetles of Western North America. Another fun beetle project that I got to do the last couple of years is the Book of Beetles. This is published by the University of Chicago Press. I'm one of several contributing writers, but I got a chance to write the introduction and other introductory parts to the book. And there are superb photographs of beetles from all around the world, representing 220 families of beetles. So this is really an excellent book. If you're not a beetle person, you'll just appreciate it for the photography and the information. And if you are a beetle person, it's a nice segue into some of these more obscure families that aren't very well known here in the New World. So once I was established in Virginia, I undertook 5 expeditions to the West. I called these Buena tours, Beetles of Western North America. And I drove between 8,000 and 10,000 miles on these trips, photographing as many of beetles as I could possibly find on these trips. And I collected them too, because it's very important to have voucher specimens. I don't always know what I'm photographing until I have the beetle in hand. Unlike butterflies, unlike some of the larger moths, many dragonflies and damselflies, although I know there are exceptions, you can't just take one photo and expect to see the characters you need to see. And with beetles in particular, we're often looking at the internal reproductive organs of the males, and sometimes the females, or difficult to see ventral characters that you're just not going to see in just one photograph. As you notice here, I spent a lot of time and covered a lot of ground in Arizona. This is one of my favorite places on the planet. And the reason that Arizona is so compelling to me, and many of you too, is because of Arizona's Sky Islands, the Madrean Sky Islands. This is a series of approximately 55 isolated mountain ranges that are blanketed with pine oak woodlands found in southwestern United States and adjacent northwestern Mexico. And these isolated mountain ranges are surrounded by deserts and grasslands. And some of the major sky islands in Arizona are going to be names that are familiar to all of you, I'm sure: the Babaquiviri Mountains, the Chiricahuas, the Huachucas, the Peñaleños, Santa Catalina, and Santa Rita Mountains. The person who first coined the term Sky Island was Weldon Heald, and he wrote an article called Sky Islands that appeared in Natural History magazine, published by the American Museum in 1951. In 1967, he published a book called Sky Island, and it was reprinted in the early 70s and called the Chiricahua Mountains. I believe it was later reprinted and expanded in the early 90s, and it was called Chiricahua Mountains Sky Island. And this book was a real eye-opener for me on many levels. It focuses on the Chiricahua Mountains, so he's writing about a lot of things I knew or should have known natural history-wise, but there was a lot of history that I didn't know. But one of the things I found really compelling was in the very last chapter, when he and his wife, I don't know the dog's name, were ready to sell their Rainbow Ranch in Cave Creek. This gentleman walked up their driveway and introduced himself as Mont Kazir. And Mont Kazir had come from the American Museum, and the American Museum was looking for a place to establish a field station to conduct research in the Southwest. And he wanted to know if the Rainbow Ranch would be for sale. And so the Rainbow Ranch became the Southwest Research Station. And having met Montgazir once and read many of his papers, I was just sort of fascinated by that little tidbit. The reason that southeastern Arizona is so compelling is because of the biotic influences. Not only do you have this archipelago of isolated mountain ranges that connects the Colorado Plateau and the Rockies to the north with the Sierra Madre Occidental to the south, but you also have these influences to the west of the Sonoran Desert, to the east, the Great Plains and the Chihuahuan Desert, and then neotropical influences that all commingle in southeastern Arizona. This is not only for beetles, but it's all insects, arthropods, plants. I'm sure I'm not telling anyone anything that you don't already know. It's just an incredible place to be, especially during the monsoon season, during the summertime. Now, since I'm covering beetles of Western North America and attempting to have a broad representation of species from Alaska to the Mexican border, it's impossible for me to do justice to a state like Arizona. So I didn't try. There are a lot of Arizona species there, don't get me wrong, but I've joined forces with Margarita Brummerman, and we're working on Arizona beetles. Margarita's been working on this project for years, photographing thousands of beetles from Arizona. This is an example of one of the plates that will be in the book of just the scarabs. But the last time I checked, and she keeps adding things and changing things, which is great, because when we get it done, it's going to be fantastic. But right now, the book covers more than 22,000 species, 2,200 species in 83 families. And so it's going to be a very extensive work. And as soon as I finish these other projects, I'll get back to it. It's primarily her photos and my words, but she's done a lot of the legwork already and compiling natural history notes and so on. And so it's really a great partnership, and I've enjoyed working with her. I thought I'd end this presentation with just some of my favorite beetles that I've found in Western North America, roughly in phylogenetic order, if you're wondering what the odd order is. The gyrinids are just amazing to me. I think they're really interesting beetles, but this one species in particular, Dinutus sublineatus, is a monster size-wise in southeastern Arizona. You don't find them in rafts like you do gyrinus. You tend to find them in ones and twos on pools along slow-moving streams, and they're just cool to watch. And sometimes they'll bumble into lights at night. One of the specialties in Western North America, which is found nowhere else in the world, are the diphyllostomatids. And there are 3 species that are described currently, thanks to Joyce Gross. I've got this wonderful picture of a male. I think Joyce is in the audience. I just want to have a shout out to her because many of her wonderful photographs appear in the book, and she was very supportive of the Eastern book as well. I was hoping to scoop one of these out of the flume when I was fluming up there, but no luck. And I just happened to find Bill Tyson has them flying around in his yard, and the foothills there near Coarsegold. And he just happened to notice the males bumbling around out in his yard one morning and saw them land in the litter, and he dug them up, and that's where he found a female. And of course, they are flightless. One of the red badges of courage, as I've called them for years, are rain beetles. Those of you that live in the Bay Area, I'm sure you're very familiar with these. Many of you elsewhere in Oregon and California certainly know them too. And they live up to their name. Depending on the species and where you are in the state, they start flying with the onset of fall and winter, early winter rains, or at the end of winter as a result of melting snow. And this is the beetle, or this is the species that brought me to the attention of Bob Duff, who set everything in motion with traveling to Arizona and my interest in scarabs. I scooped up a couple of these in a swimming pool where I worked, or where I lived. I used to do yard work for these people. And in February, I found these big hairy beetles just bobbing along in the water. I had no idea what they were. I proudly pinned them up to show them off to the curators at the Natural History Museum to show them that I was serious. And Bob recognized them right away. And it turns out those were the first specimens that weren't known from the type locality, which was only a few miles away. Turns out that they have several populations along the San Andreas Fault. This is the female of another species, Pleocoma lindsleyi. I'm sure you'll recognize that specific epithet, and many of you, I'm sure, knew Frank Avor, who was a well-known coleopterist who worked on not only Pleocoma, but Longhorn Beetles, Cerambycids. And this is the female, and females are typically apterous. They're wingless. During rains, they just come up to the surface, release their pheromones, and the males with these incredible antennal structures hone in on the female's pheromones. I had not seen these beetles in 30 years. I made one trip during the wintertime in 2016 and just lucked into a flight of Pleocoma octopagina. I went to a spot where I had collected female rain beetles 30 years before, not expecting to find any. And I saw a hole that looked suspicious, and I did what you're not supposed to do. And I stuck my finger in the hole like I always did. And sure enough, I could feel the female inside. Cricena are real crowd pleasers. Any of you that have been to Arizona or Western Texas are familiar with the 4 species of Cricena that we have here in the United States. The bulk of the species are found in southern Mexico, Central America. There's a few species that reach northern South America, but these are very common, widespread beetles. Byeri, the adults feed on oak, Gloriosas on juniper, Lecontes on pine, so you have to have the right hosts around. But there are a couple of spots in Arizona that you can find all 3 species in the same spot. They're very common, but when I see them, it's like seeing old friends. I enjoy finding them at delights. And other crowd pleasers too, Dynastes granti, one of the 2 species of Dynastes that we have here in the United States, and of course the ox beetle, Strategos aloeus. Notice the spelling here, everybody. I've been misspelling this for years. In the original publication, horn spelled granti with 2 I's. And I know that there are people that will argue with you about this, but if you go back to the original publication, the original spelling is what should be used. Brett Ratcliffe brought this to everybody's attention a few years ago with his excellent book on the dynastines of the United States and Canada. I just include these beetles because I think they're cool. Euphoria fly just at the beginning of the monsoons in Arizona. I've always missed them because I get there a little bit late. 2018, I was there for the first rains, and there were so many beetles there that I had never seen before, or had never seen them in such numbers, or had never seen them in such good condition. Usually by the time I get there, they're walking on stumps and their colors are worn off. It was incredible. Buprestidae, Chuck Bellamy got me started on buprestids, and I'm sorry to say that not until his passing did I really get it and finally start doing a little more field work with them. But one night I was driving from Southern California to Arizona. It was getting late along the Colorado River, and I thought, I'm just going to stop and put out my light. I pulled off the road, and the air was just buzzing with these 1/2 inch, 3/4 inch long buprestids. They were all over the creosote. There were thousands of them just everywhere, and I just happened to land right in the middle of them. Thrincopyge is a very difficult beetle to collect because you've got to peel back the strands of sodal, this sort of yucca-like plant, but they're grass-like leaves. And the edges of these leaves are serrated, and it's like 1,000 paper cuts if you're doing it with your bare hands, but it can be worthwhile. There's several interesting species of click beetles, several species of Calcolippidius, both in Southern California, but most of them are in Southern Arizona. We have 3 species of eyed click beetles, 2 of them more common in Western North America. I just included this because this is a species that I think is really cool. And it's found in Southern California in the foothills. The males are fully winged. They have these great pectinate antennae. The females are flightless and they have reduced elytra. And every once in a while, they turn up in the outskirts just above Los Angeles in the foothills. I was ready to put this book to bed. I mean, just days away, and I had not found a decent photo of a female. They just weren't to be had. And I just happened to look on Bug Guide, I think it was, one more time, and Bob Allen had just posted this image of a female just days before I was ready to submit the manuscript. So timing is everything. Netwing beetles are just really interesting to me because of their behavior. They're soft-wing species. They're chemically defended. They're aposematically colored. And there are several species that form these very conspicuous mating swarms in southeastern Arizona in particular. Lampyrids, I'm in Firefly Central right now in Virginia, at least earlier in the summer. I've got them in my yard. It's fantastic. But I didn't know about them in California until I stumbled into the pink glowworms that occur in foothills in the Los Angeles basin and elsewhere. This particular species is reasonably widespread in parts of California and Arizona. And the males do not bioluminesce as they fly, although under duress, they will have a weak flash. Occasionally they're collected at lights at night. Just when I first started photographing insects on slide film, I was up in the foothills above Los Angeles, and I knew a place where there were pink glowworms, and I just stumbled into this pink glowworm that's being mobbed by these males. Only one is successfully coupled with her, but the others are jockeying for position. The Fengotids, this is Zarhippus integrapennis. This is a beetle I grew up with. It commonly showed up to the lights at my home where I grew up during the spring. I had no idea what it was until many years later. This beetle, or this larva or larviform female, I had collected for many years. I had no idea what it was. And I remember before that very first trip I took to the Natural History Museum, I found one under some debris, and I put it in a jar, and I woke up in the middle of the night and the jar was aglow. They are the railroad worm. There are lights all down the back. You can see how they're lit here. That was the first bioluminescent organism I'd ever seen. And it was 2 o'clock in the morning. I ran into my parents' room. I told my mother. She wasn't nearly as enthusiastic as I was, but I got to take it to the museum and share it with the curators there. Just want to throw in a few others. I know this is going on a little bit long. I appreciate your indulgence here, or indulging me. Edrotes ventricosus, my friend Chris Worth has been working on this group of, this tribe of tenebrionid beetles. I have very fond memories of them because when I moved from Lancaster to the foothills of the Mojave Desert, when I'd go to school, these beetles were all over the schoolyard, and I used to fill up my Get Smart and Superman lunch pails with these beetles and take them home and set them up in a terrarium. I just thought that was cool. And for those of you in the insect zoo business, you're all familiar with the blue death feigners, desert ironclad beetles. You know, they have all kinds of common names, but these are tenebrionid beetles that have this waxy bloom, at least when they're really hot and dry. And they're very long lives, so they're very popular in insect zoos. And only recently, I think, some people started to have some success in breeding them in captivity. But if you treat them right, they're very long lives, so there really hasn't been a need to breed them in captivity. Blister beetles have always been one of my favorite insects, just because they're so different from the usual beetle gestalt. They have these very distinct ant-like heads. They've got very cool biologies. Depending on the subfamily or tribe that you're looking at, their larvae are parasitoids on grasshopper eggs, or the larvae and pollen caches of ground nesting bees. Clarid beetles, I think checkered beetles are really interesting, and of course many of them are predatory. Some of them are considered to be important checks on bark beetles in some areas. But again, I just think they're very interesting. Some of them are mimics of wasps or ants. Aerotylids, Cypherotilus, the genus has been bounced back and forth. It's now back firmly in Cypherotilus, I think. Don't let Californicus fool you. It's not found in California or Baja California. Who knows? But again, this is a very familiar insect in southeastern Arizona. I mean, we don't have enough blue beetles as far as I'm concerned. And if you see them at the right time, you'll see the adults feeding on fungus. You'll see the larvae in the same areas. And on overhanging logs, you'll see where the larvae pupate right at the ends of their last cast exoskeletons, and you'll just see masses of them, particularly in the canyons. Longhorn beetles are very popular. I grew up with Prionis flying into the lights. My dad mounted a mercury vapor lamp on the wall of our garage just so I could collect insects. One of my trips to Arizona was the first and only time I've seen this into this species, Elytroleptis ignitus. There's another one, Apicalis. This is a predatory species, and it is found within the mating swarms of similar looking Netwing Beetles. I have yet to see them in these swarms. Every time I see a swarm, I look and I never see the Longhorn Beetles, but I know they're out there. I know people have found them. There's a great paper that appeared in the 1960s describing this relationship. I just think anything that feeds on cactus is cool. Monolema is a really interesting insect. I grew up with a species found in the foothills of the Mojave Desert. The very first insect I ever pinned was a Monolema in 1970. Pinned it right through the thorax, the pronotum, just where you're not supposed to. Purpurocetus magnificus is one of these holy grails that collectors go after in Arizona. They only come out every 3 years and only for a few days at a time, where they emerge out of oaks. This was the year that they came out, and several people found them in areas throughout Arizona. I've never seen them in the wild, but I was lucky to have people who knew I was trying to photograph different beetles, and they would collect things for me alive and allow me to photograph them. Weevils. Weevils are great. Bob Anderson has given me a whole new appreciation on weevils. I'm not always photographing beetles when I go out, although that's what I'm normally doing. I try to photograph other insects and arthropods when I'm out and about. Southern California and Arizona in particular during the summer are target-rich environments. So this is one of those happy instances where I found a very cooperative cicada. And I took its picture, and not till I got home did I realize it was laying eggs. You can see the little divots that it's punched out of this grass stem, and it's inserting eggs inside. But I've gotten to see a lot of really interesting things as I'm out and about preparing for this book. I want to end by saying special thanks to my wife, who you can barely see just here. There she is, Paula. Without her support and love, all of my entomological endeavors would have been greatly diminished this century. I have her to thank for the support and flexibility that I've had this past 20 years to do all the things that I've done. And here we are, rosy-cheeked in Madera Canyon. Okay, this is where you need to get your pens and pencils. If you are interested in purchasing an autographed or inscribed copy, inscribed, of course, is, me writing to you saying we'll always have Paris or the Pacific Coast Entomological Society, pick whatever. This is your opportunity. They'll be available from BioQuip, but you won't find them in the catalog. Go to bioquip.com and then click on My Cart. And then in the part number, type in 3811WS. WS are capital letters. So go to bioquip.com, go directly to My Cart, whether you have an account or not, type in 3811WS, and immediately it'll be populated with the article or the part name, Beetles of Western North America. In the notes section at the bottom of the page, indicate whether you want an autographed or inscribed copy. I will be autographing these copies and inscribing them to you. I am not signing a pile of them and then sending them off somewhere, because BioQuip has made an arrangement that the books will come here to Richmond. And as your orders come in, I will sign them and then package them and mail them directly to you from Richmond, Virginia. So if you're interested, I'm sure they would be happy to sell you something that I haven't touched either. So if that's your preference, and of course, these books are going to be available anywhere, but for signed copies, this is something that I've worked out in the time of COVID. So to give us a sense that we were together and you have a copy of a book that I was signing for you, and you know that. And I just want to end with one of my favorite vistas. in southeastern Arizona. This is from the Patagonia Mountains. It's sunset looking westward toward the Babakivri Mountains, and that's Babakivri Peak off in the mists. Thank you very much. I know this has gone a bit long, but you've been a very good audience, and I appreciate this opportunity to share this book with you. Appreciate it.
Yay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Art.
Yeah, thanks.
And if anybody has any questions or comments, I'm not very good. I guess I could go through the chat in case there's something directed to me, but I'm terrible at these things. Oh, Patrick. All right, let's see. Someone comments that, wow, things are coming in fast and furious here. Let me start at the top. And feel free to shout something out in case until I find something. Oh, Candace Gilmore. I had no idea you were from Palmdale.
I lived
All
there
right.
for about 4 years when I was like between 4 and 7, I think.
Well, good for you. You got out too then. I never went to Palmdale. I never lived in Palmdale, but I went to Palmdale High School and I got an excellent education there. I'll just say it without hesitation.
Nice.
And yeah, Charles Griswold and Teresa. Yes, we all first met in South Africa. We were all together there when I was a student, and Charles was working, oh, I forget which museum, Bloemfontein, is that right? I can't remember. And Teresa, we shared many meals together. It was nice hanging out with Americans every once in a while. You know, it gave them a break from us and gave us a break from them. And Leslie Saul Gershens, nice to hear from you. Yes, Leslie was instrumental in, she was on my places of had to go to figure out, okay, I've signed up to start an insect zoo, now what? And Leslie, as director of the insect zoo at the San Francisco Zoo, was incredibly generous and made me feel like that I could actually do this. So thank you so much. And David Ortega says that his GF, I'm assuming that's girlfriend, gifted the book. She's a keeper. And yes, Alexander. Alexander joined me at Sagehen Field Station in 2018, and we spent a wonderful 4 or 5 days together. I've known Alexander since he was a kid. I don't want to embarrass him. When he was a Lorquin kid, went on to get his degree at UC Davis in entomology and is now working with the Department of Agriculture. Is that Solano County? You just
Sonoma County.
Sonoma County. I know it was an S. Forgive me, you've moved, but we had a great time. That was fun. And as I recall, 1 or 2 of your friends came along, and one of my old classmates. Sorry, it's Old Home Week here. Sorry. Let's see. Meat traps. Terrific talk. Thank you, Patrick Goring. Good to hear from you. What was your most challenging Western specimen to find or photograph? Boy, that's a tough one. I can't think of one thing that I needed and couldn't get or had difficulty in photographing. Every once in a while, there was a species that I thought it's got to be in the book, and somebody has to have that picture. I was trying to be very picky about photographs. And I'll tell you, I was really lucky to have people like Joyce Gross and Jim Hogue and others who had excellent photographs, and a lot of the things that I thought were must have, they had. If I didn't, they did. Alice Abela is another person who has great photographs. Margarita Brummerman bailed me out numerous times for other things. I don't want to leave anybody out. Like I say, I had almost 120 photographers that stepped up and made this book what it is. And for them, I'll be forever grateful. Andrew Meads, thank you so much. Federica, good to hear from you. Yes, I had fantastic parents. Let's see, Eddie wants to know about Lampyrids, the weakly bioluminescent. That's a good question. I don't know of other species. I'm not that familiar with many Lampyrids in California. The only ones I had any experience with was the pink glowworms, and that one night near Wrightwood, just after I graduated from high school. It was July 4th weekend. I had my black light up and the sheet was covered with males. That's my one firsthand experience, other than seeing them in ones and twos hanging off a lone female. That's it. But I know that there are bioluminescent species in Arizona. Certainly, there's one that gets around Pena Blanca Lake. That's the first time I'd ever seen them in the wild. That's a great place to find them there. David Ortega, also in Antelope Valley. Gosh, who'd have thought? That's, like I said, I was born in Lancaster, moved to Juniper Hills, doing Little Rock and Pear Blossom up in the foothills. Talk about the videos I made. This is Alan Kaplan wants me to talk about the videos I made with Cricena Ricci. There's talking about my past coming back to haunt me. Yes, I did a series of children's videos called Bug City with Cricena Ricci. She was my co-host, and it was interesting. We had a big puppet named Bugsy Seagull that was sort of wisecracking. The interesting thing for me about that is the puppeteers that operated Bugsy were the same puppeteers that operated the alien monster in the very first Alien film. And this was in the mid-90s, and they gave me a letterbox VHS version of the film. That was really cool. This is before DVDs or Blu-ray or anything. Those videos are out there. You can still catch them once in a while on YouTube. They're still available for purchase. I'm hearing from kids that are all grown up that are sharing them with their children. I don't know what to say about that, but I'm glad they're enjoying them. If anybody's interested, What's Bugging You? This radio program I did, 3-minute segments here in Richmond for 10 years. They've taken 6 segments and animated them. And if you'd like to check those out, visit my Dr. Art Evans Facebook page on, and I have the links there, and you can visit that. Thank you so much for your kind remarks, everyone. Let's see, I still want to know about how the V-shaped trap works. Can you show it to me again? I don't know.
Sorry, I'm being kind of dense about that, but when I saw that trap, I saw you had the metal bar in the bottom, and then you had the receptacles. And so I couldn't see how they get from the bottom to the receptacles.
They're coming from the outside.
So they're flying in from above, and they go bang and bounce down. Is that it?
Yeah, and they're bouncing down the angle right down to the fluid. Yes, things will bounce around in the trough. And if there's water accumulating there, you may find them there, but if they can get out, they will. Yeah.
Thank you.
All right. Well, I think that's all the questions on the chat. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you, everybody, again. I really appreciate this opportunity. It's nice to see so many familiar faces. And I'm grateful to see my collaborators out there, my photographers. Joyce, it's great to see you. Our paths seldom cross in the real world, but man, you have been such a strong supporter of my works. And I really admire your books too. The California insect book, your photography in there is great. I thoroughly enjoy that book.